My name is Laura Mitchell, and by the time I turned 30, I thought I had finally built the kind of life people dream of. I owned a small boutique in Flagstaff, Arizona, tucked between pine-covered hills and the crisp mountain air that always smelled faintly of snow, even in the warmer months. It wasn't a big store, nothing glamorous compared to the fashion capitals, but it was mine. Every dress, every stitch, every client who came in and left smiling made me feel like I had carved out a corner of the world that belonged only to me. I wasn't the type who leaned on others. While some women my age had families pushing them toward comfortable marriages and easier lives, I turned down countless attempts at matchmaking. I didn't want a husband because he came with a paycheck or because he was safe. I wanted to build something on my own first, and for years I did. Then came Eric. Eric Mitchell wasn't wealthy, wasn't polished, and certainly wasn't one of the men my relatives would have approved of. He worked at an auto shop downtown, the kind of place where grease and oil seemed baked into the walls. But he had hands that could take apart an engine and put it back together smoother than before. And he had a smile that made me believe he was different from all the others, the ones who wanted me for what I owned rather than who I was. Eric made me feel like I wasn't just Laura, the boutique owner. I was Laura, the woman he wanted to spend his life with. For years, that was enough. We built a marriage on what felt like hard work and honesty. He teased me for being too serious about fabrics and designs, and I teased him for always coming home with grease under his nails. We didn't fight much. We were too busy chasing our dreams. So when he suggested one Friday morning that we take a break and drive out to the river, I didn't think twice. It was Friday the 13th, and Eric, with a playful grin, told me maybe we should make our own luck. He said we hadn't been back to our spot in years, the place where he had asked me to marry him, with the water rushing behind us and the sky wide open above. Just the memory of that day softened something in me, and I agreed. The drive out was long, winding through the forest roads outside Flagstaff. As the city fell away behind us, my heart lightened. Eric even put on the old playlist we used to listen to when we first dated, and for a moment, I let myself fall into the nostalgia. I leaned against him, breathing in the pine-scented air through the open window. For once, life felt simple again. When we finally reached the hill, I remembered why it had always felt magical. The slope was steep, covered in wild grass and thorny bushes, but at the bottom, the river gleamed, dark and wide, its surface reflecting the clouds. I laughed as the wind whipped my hair, stretching my arms wide like a girl half my age. For a moment, I was back in that time when we were young and everything seemed ahead of us. Then I felt his hands on my waist. I thought he was pulling me close, like he had so many times before. But the embrace tightened, turned sharp, and in one sudden, brutal motion, he shoved me forward. My feet lost the ground. The sky tilted. And before I could even scream, I was falling, plunging straight into the black, unforgiving water below. The water swallowed me whole. One moment I was standing on solid ground. The next I was spinning through cold darkness, my lungs already screaming for air. The river was nothing like the sparkling streams I had swum in as a child. This was black, heavy, merciless. The current dragged me under as though it had been waiting for me. I kicked and clawed at the water, but every direction felt the same. Up, down, it all blurred together. Panic burned through me. My chest tightened. My mouth opened against my will, and I tasted mud, grit, the bitter sting of silt scraping my throat. I told myself to fight, to keep swimming, but I had no sense of where the surface was. My body thrashed blindly, my arms flailing, my legs cramping. For the first time in years, I felt the raw terror of being utterly powerless. The water pressed in on me, muffling everything, the beat of my heart, the fragments of thought still clinging to me. In those final, terrifying seconds, I almost let go. My body begged for oxygen, my vision exploded into stars, and all I could think was, this is it. Eric has killed me. But then, through the blur, something touched me. A hand, strong, insistent, gripped my arm. For an instant, I thought it was Eric, dragging me deeper. But the pull was upward, not down. My body rose against the weight of the river, toward a light that shimmered faintly above. And then nothing. When I woke, I wasn't dead. The first thing I noticed was pain. Every muscle ached, my ribs stabbed with every breath, and my throat burned as though I'd swallowed glass. I tried to open my eyes, but everything was dark. For one awful heartbeat, I thought I had gone blind. Then I realized there were bandages wrapped tight across my face. Panic surged again. I shifted, trying to sit up, but my body protested, weak and clumsy. That's when I heard it, a voice. Deep, rough, with the gravelly tone of a man who had spent years speaking little and working hard. "Easy," he said. "You're safe now." I froze. I didn't know the voice. I didn't know where I was. The surface beneath me was firm but uneven wooden. The faint smell of smoke and pine resin told me I wasn't in a hospital. My lips cracked as I tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. "You're thirsty," the man said, closer now. A cup touched my mouth. Water, real water, clean and cool, poured down my throat. I coughed and sputtered, embarrassed by the weakness of it, but after a few careful sips, relief spread through me like sunlight. "Better?" he asked. I managed the smallest nod. My voice was still a whisper, but I croaked out, "Where?" "In my cabin," he answered simply. "You nearly drowned. I pulled you out." Cabin. That explained the smell of wood, the faint creak beneath me. I was alive because this stranger had been in the right place at the right time. "I'm Daniel Cross," he added, as if reading my mind. I couldn't see his face, but something in his tone anchored me. He didn't sound threatening, just steady, almost matter-of-fact. A spoon brushed my lips next. Warm broth, chicken, salty and comforting, slid over my tongue. My body, desperate for strength, welcomed it. For the first time since the fall, I felt the tiniest spark of safety. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it was slowly giving way to something else. Gratitude. Days blurred into one another as I drifted in and out of sleep. Slowly, the bandages around my eyes loosened. At first, the world returned to me in fragments, shadows, outlines, shapes that made no sense. Then one morning, the haze lifted, and I finally saw the man who had saved me. Daniel Cross looked like he belonged to the mountains. He was somewhere in his 40s, his face lined and weathered, the kind of face carved by sun, wind, and years of solitude. His beard was trimmed but rough, peppered with gray, and his eyes were a sharp, steady blue that studied me as though he'd already weighed my soul and decided to keep me alive anyway. "You're healing," he said when he caught me staring. His voice was calm, unhurried, with that same gravelly edge I remembered from the night I woke. I nodded weakly. "You saved me." He shrugged, as if pulling half-drowned strangers from rivers was just another chore. "Couldn't leave you there." Later, when I had enough strength to sit up and hold a cup of broth without spilling it, he told me more. His name I already knew, but now he added details. That he had once been a police officer in Phoenix, the kind who chased down criminals and thought he'd spent his life in the force. Then his father got sick, and Daniel left it all behind to care for him. After his father passed, Daniel stayed in the forest, living in a modest cabin on the edge of Flagstaff's vast wilderness. He never went back to the city. There was something about the way he spoke, matter-of-fact, without regret, that made me both wary and curious. He was a stranger, yet he felt grounded, dependable, like the sturdy timbers of the cabin itself. I didn't know if I could trust him, but every instinct in me wanted to. A few days later, Daniel decided I needed to walk. My legs still trembled beneath me, but he offered his arm without hesitation, steadying me as I shuffled out into the cold mountain air. The world outside was breathtaking. Tall pines towered overhead, their needles whispering in the wind. The ground was crusted with frost, and the air was sharp, biting at my lungs but filling me with life. The cabin stood alone on a small clearing, with only the sound of the river in the distance. It was remote, isolated, exactly the kind of place no one would ever think to look for me. I gripped his arm tighter. "It's so quiet." "That's the point," he replied. His gaze swept the tree-line like a man who was always watching, always waiting. It was later that afternoon, while Daniel stacked firewood by the side of the cabin, that another figure appeared. At first, I thought she was some apparition, a bent old woman making her way across the clearing with surprising speed, her shawl flapping around her thin shoulders. "This is Aunt Lucille," Daniel said, setting down the wood. "She's the healer." Her eyes, sharp and dark, swept over me in a single glance that felt like being stripped bare. She muttered something under her breath, then reached out, her hands surprisingly warm as they pressed against mine. "You weren't meant to fall," she said, her voice low but firm. "Someone close to you pushed you there. Blood of your own. And not just for hate, but for money. And another woman." Her words hit harder than the river ever had. I froze, staring at her, my mind racing. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that Eric would never. But the chill creeping through me told me she wasn't guessing. She was naming the shadow already taking shape in my heart. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to speak without proof. A few days after Aunt Lucille's unsettling visit, he left the cabin early in the morning. When he came back that evening, his boots were muddy, his face more serious than usual. "I checked the spot," he said simply. "Where you fell." My chest tightened. "There were tire tracks near the slope," he continued. "Not just mine. Fresh ones. And footprints, 2 sets. Someone else was there with your husband." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that Eric would never, but the words died in my throat. The memory of that shove, the strength of his hands, was still branded into my body. Daniel studied me, waiting. Finally, he sighed. "Laura, you didn't slip. Someone made sure you went over that edge." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the wooden table to steady myself. But why? Why would he? Before I could finish, Daniel set a folded newspaper in front of me. My hands shook as I opened it. The headline blurred before my eyes, but I forced myself to read. "Local woman drowns in river. Husband mourns loss." My name was there. My boutique. My supposed tragic accident. Eric had told the police that I drowned during a hike by the river. According to the article, a body had been found downstream, already buried after formal identification. I stared at the page until the letters swam. Buried. Someone had been buried in my place. And Eric, my husband, had stood there, told him it was me, and walked away. The pain was different from the cold water that had nearly claimed me. This was sharper, deeper. It hollowed me out from the inside. I felt numb, then burning, then nothing at all. My husband, the man I had trusted more than anyone, had already buried me alive. My voice cracked. He told them I was dead. Daniel's expression softened, but his tone stayed steady. "That's why you can't go back. Not yet. If you show up now, he'll have a story ready. He'll call it a mistake, say he was grieving, and then he'll try again. Only next time he won't leave you a chance." I wanted to scream, to run into town, to confront Eric and demand answers. But the truth was lodged inside me like a stone. I was safer here than anywhere else. I sat back down, trembling, clutching the newspaper. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why would he want me gone? We weren't perfect, but we were fine. Daniel didn't answer right away. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the stove. "That's the question, isn't it? Men don't usually risk everything without a reason." The fire popped, sending sparks into the chimney. I shivered despite the heat. For the first time, doubt seeped into the cracks of my memories. Eric's smile, his long hours at the garage, the late nights he claimed were for work. Had there been signs I'd ignored? I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was already unraveling, thread by thread, and no matter how tightly I tried to hold on, The picture of my marriage was coming apart. It was a few nights later when Daniel came back from town with a look in his eyes that made my stomach knot. He set his jacket on the chair, then leaned his palms against the table as if weighing how much to tell me. "I know who he's with," he said finally. I froze. "Who?" "Melissa Parker. 25, maybe 26. Works as a paralegal at a law office in Flagstaff. That office handles probate and inheritance cases." The room fell silent, save for the soft crackle of the fire. His words pressed against my chest like a heavy stone. Melissa Parker. A name I had never heard. But suddenly it explained too much. Daniel continued, his voice measured. "She has access to records. Most people wouldn't. If your husband knows about something you don't, something worth money, she could be the one feeding him that information." I shook my head instinctively. "There's nothing. I don't have. I own my boutique, but that's not enough to..." And then it hit me. A memory, distant, nearly forgotten. My Uncle Carl, who had lived his entire life in Germany. He never married, never had children. I hadn't seen him in years, not since before I met Eric. When he passed away, I remembered getting a letter, vague and formal, but I was too consumed with my boutique at the time to think much of it. Could there have been more? My throat tightened. My uncle, he died overseas. I thought whatever he had would have been handled there. I never followed up. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Then that could be it. If there's an inheritance tied to you, your husband and this Melissa may have decided you were in the way." The idea made me dizzy. Eric, my Eric, plotting with another woman. Not just to leave me, but to erase me entirely so he could collect money that I didn't even know was mine. Daniel straightened. "I still have contacts. People who owe me favors. I'll find out exactly what they're after." "But Laura!" His gaze held mine, sharp, unflinching. "You need to be ready for the truth. And it may not be what you want to hear." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Eric wasn't capable of that kind of cruelty. But the echo of the river, the memory of his hands shoving me into the void, silenced me. That night, Daniel left again. He moved with the precision of someone who had lived his life reading lies off of people's faces, following trails no one else noticed. He knew how to ask the right questions, where to look without being seen. Watching him, I realized this was second nature to him. His old life as a cop hadn't vanished. It had simply gone quiet until now. When he returned, he carried a small notebook filled with scribbles. He didn't show me everything, but the essentials were clear. Eric and Melissa had been meeting for months. Witnesses saw them together in town, not hiding nearly as well as they thought. And more than once, Melissa had been overheard mentioning papers, documents, transfers, legal things I didn't understand. Every word cracked something deeper inside me. I wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, that Eric was lost, confused, manipulated, that the man who once made me laugh in the middle of grocery store aisles hadn't decided my life was disposable. But the evidence was piling up. Daniel's steady voice, Melissa's name, the inheritance I never even knew existed. All of it stacked against the one thing I still wanted to believe, that my marriage had been real. My heart ached so fiercely it felt like it might split open. Love and betrayal churned inside me, warring until I couldn't tell one from the other. Part of me prayed Daniel had made a mistake. The other part knew, with every trembling breath, that he hadn't. Daniel laid it out for me one evening as the fire threw long shadows across the cabin walls. He had been quiet all day, working outside, his jaw set the way it always was when his mind was busy. When he finally came in, he closed the door behind him and said, "It's time we stop waiting. We need to bring him to us." I looked up from the chair where I sat with a blanket around my shoulders. "Bring who?" But I already knew. "Eric," Daniel said. His voice was steady, but his eyes told me he had already played this plan through in his head 100 times. "We'll lure him back to the river, the same place it happened. Men like him, they think they're smarter than everyone else. He'll believe he's in control. That's when we'll catch him saying what we need. My throat went dry. You mean you want me to see him? Not at first, Daniel answered quickly. You'll stay hidden. I'll handle him. But when the moment comes, if you're strong enough, you'll step out. You deserve to hear the truth from his own mouth. I clutched the blanket tighter. The thought of facing Eric again made my stomach twist. The man I had once shared a bed with, who had kissed my forehead before leaving for work, had also pushed me off a cliff into black water. How could I stand in front of him without collapsing? Daniel must have seen the fear in my face. He crouched beside me, his voice gentler. I'll be there. He won't touch you again. But Laura, you need closure. Otherwise, you'll never stop wondering if you imagined it all. This way, we'll have proof. I closed my eyes. Proof. That word echoed inside me. Proof that the life I had lived wasn't a lie, or proof that it was. Either way, I needed to know. Slowly, I nodded. Okay, we'll do it. The following days were spent preparing. Daniel taught me how to move quietly in the woods, how to find a hiding spot where I could see without being seen. He made me practice holding my breath, steadying my racing heart so it wouldn't give me away. He showed me the small recorder he carried, old but reliable, and explained how it would capture every word Eric said. At night, I lay awake on the narrow bed, my mind drifting back to the past. I remembered Eric the way he used to be, grinning at me across a greasy diner table, pulling me into his arms after long shifts, whispering promises of forever. Those memories once felt like treasures. Now they cut like shards of glass. How could those same hands that once wiped away my tears be the same that shoved me into the void? Every time the doubt crept in, every time I almost convinced myself this was all some horrible misunderstanding, I saw the newspaper headline again. Local woman drowns. My name beneath it. My husband's lie. One evening, as I crouched behind a cluster of rocks practicing how to stay still, Daniel's voice broke through my thoughts. You're stronger than you think, Laura. I met his gaze, my chest heaving. I don't feel strong. That's what makes it real, he said simply. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's facing it anyway. His words stayed with me as the plan took shape. I was terrified, but beneath that fear was something sharper, a hunger for the truth. And for the first time since the river swallowed me, I wanted to fight. The day of the confrontation felt colder than any other. Even wrapped in Daniel's heavy jacket, I couldn't stop shaking as we rode the motorcycle down the narrow trail toward the river. My hands clutched his waist, but it wasn't the wind making me tremble. It was the knowledge that in just a short time, I would be near Eric again. We arrived at the cliffside where my life had almost ended. Daniel helped me down and guided me to a thicket of brush not far from the edge. Stay here, he whispered, setting the recorder in his pocket and adjusting the small camera strapped discreetly to his jacket. Don't move until I signal, no matter what you hear. I crouched low, my knees pressed into the damp earth. My heart hammered, so hard I thought it might give me away before anything even started. The sound of a car approaching made every muscle in my body tense. Tires crunched over gravel, then stopped. Through the leaves, I saw Eric step out of the driver's seat. He looked the same confident stride, same familiar jacket, but beside him was Melissa Parker, young, polished, with sharp eyes that darted nervously across the clearing. Daniel stepped into view, calm, collected. Eric Mitchell. His voice carried just enough authority to make Eric stiffen. Eric narrowed his eyes. Who the hell are you? Doesn't matter, Daniel replied. What matters is I know what you did, and I know why. You want this to go away, it's going to cost you. Eric's jaw clenched. You're bluffing. Am I? Daniel pulled out his phone, tapping the screen as though showing proof. I have enough to bury you. Unless, of course, you'd rather confess now. Melissa's voice cracked. Eric, what is he talking about? Shut up, Eric hissed, but she stepped closer to him, her voice rising. You said no one knew. You said it was an accident. The words sliced through me. My nails dug into the soil as I struggled to keep from gasping out loud. Daniel tilted his head. Accident, huh? Why don't you tell her the truth, Eric? Tell her how you shoved your wife into the river. Eric's face turned red, veins pulsing at his temple. You don't know what you're talking about. Melissa spun on him, panic spreading across her face. You told me she slipped. You told me enough. Eric snapped, his voice breaking. She was in the way, all right? She cared more about her damn boutique than she ever cared about me. She left me with nothing but bills and excuses. What was I supposed to do? The world seemed to tilt. My heart stopped. My husband had just confessed, and the words were as cruel as the shove that sent me into the water. Daniel's camera blinked steadily, capturing it all. His voice was low, even. So you admit it. Eric's chest heaved. You think you're clever, setting me up like this? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Melissa backed away, trembling. Eric, this is insane. That's when Daniel glanced toward my hiding spot and gave the smallest nod. My legs felt like stone, but somehow I stood, pushing through the brush into the open. Eric's eyes landed on me, and for a moment, all color drained from his face. No, his voice cracked. You're dead. I buried you. I took another step forward, my heart racing, my hands shaking. Surprise! I whispered, though my throat burned with rage. He staggered back, his expression twisting from shock into something darker. Fear, fury, and desperation all at once. You ruined everything, he screamed, his voice ragged. All you ever cared about was work, your shop, your precious clients. You never cared about me. You made me nothing. His words hit me like blows, but this time I didn't flinch. I saw him clearly now, not as the man I once loved, but as the stranger who had tried to erase me. The moment Eric's rant echoed into the trees, Daniel moved. In one swift motion, he pulled a pair of cuffs from his jacket and had Eric's arms pinned behind his back before he even realized what was happening. Eric struggled, shouting curses, but Daniel's grip was unshakable, practiced. The grip of a man who had done this countless times before. Let go of me. You don't have the right. Eric spat, but Daniel's voice cut through his rage, calm and certain. You gave up your rights when you tried to kill your wife. Melissa stood frozen a few feet away, her face pale, her eyes darting between me and Daniel as if searching for an escape. When Daniel pulled out the small camera and held it up, the light still blinking, Melissa's composure shattered. It wasn't my idea, she cried suddenly, her voice shrill, desperate. He told me it was the only way. I swear I never touched her. I just told him about the inheritance. I didn't think he'd actually do it. Her words tumbled out in a rush, the truth spilling in fragments, as though she could bargain her way into safety. I watched her, numb, realizing how small and pitiful she looked now without the secrecy and stolen confidence. Daniel didn't even look at her. He had already pulled out his phone, dialing quickly, his voice clipped as he identified himself and relayed what had just occurred. It wasn't long before the sound of sirens grew faint in the distance, weaving through the trees until red and blue lights cut across the clearing. 2 deputies emerged, taking Eric from Daniel's hold. My husband, or the man who once had been my husband, thrashed against them, still yelling, still trying to cast himself as the victim. But his voice no longer carried weight. To me, it was just noise, empty and hollow. Melissa, trembling, repeated her confession to the deputies almost word for word, as though saying it again might cleanse her of her part in it all. They listened, took notes, and led her away too. And then it was quiet again. I stood a few paces away, staring at Eric as the deputies pushed him toward the patrol car. For so long, I had imagined what it would be like to see him again, to confront the man who had betrayed me. I thought I would scream or sob or beg him to tell me why. But when the moment finally came, I felt nothing. No fury, No heartbreak. Just a stillness, a hollow where the love used to be. He glanced back at me once, his eyes wild, his mouth twisted in a sneer. But I didn't see the man I had fallen in love with. I saw only a coward, small, broken, and consumed by his own bitterness. As the patrol car disappeared down the trail, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My body felt lighter, as though some invisible weight had slipped from my shoulders. Daniel touched my arm lightly, guiding me away from the clearing. We walked back into the forest together, the pine needles soft under our boots, the air sharp and cold. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. For the first time since the river, silence didn't feel terrifying. It felt like release. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into someone else's story. The investigation moved quickly once Daniel turned over the footage and Melissa's panicked confession. Eric was charged, and suddenly the man who had once shared my home was just another headline in the local paper. His name no longer belonged to me. At first, I didn't know what life after him would look like. But slowly, piece by piece, I began to rebuild. The inheritance that Eric and Melissa had tried to steal from me was finally confirmed. My uncle had indeed left me everything, properties, savings, and investments I had never imagined. It wasn't just money. It was freedom. I poured that freedom back into the thing I loved most. My boutique, once a tiny shop tucked away in Flagstaff, grew. I expanded to new locations, hired young designers who reminded me of myself, hungry to create something beautiful out of nothing. What had once been just a corner of my life became a chain of stores that carried my name. Every storefront felt like a promise fulfilled, not just to me, but to the girl I once was, the girl who thought hard work alone would be enough. Through it all, Daniel stayed close. He never tried to take control of my life, never spoke over my decisions. He was simply there, steady, dependable, the kind of presence that anchored me when the world felt too big. Sometimes I caught him watching me with a quiet smile, and though neither of us rushed to label what we had, I knew I had found a companion who understood not only my scars, but the strength that grew from them. One afternoon, months after it all, I returned to the river, the same one that had nearly swallowed me. But this time, the water was different, clear, sparkling under the Arizona sun, rushing over the rocks like a song. I stood at the bank, my heart racing, then stepped forward. The cold hit me instantly, sharp but invigorating. I let it wrap around me, let it seep into every pore. For the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt reborn. When I emerged from the water, Daniel was there, pulling me into his arms. He lifted me effortlessly, holding me against his chest as if I weighed nothing. Drops of water clung to my skin, and the wind whispered through the pines. In that moment, I felt it, the truth I had been chasing since the night of the fall. I hadn't just survived. I had been remade. I rested my head against him, the world quiet around us. No shouts, no betrayals, no ghosts. Just the steady beat of his heart and the river flowing beside us. Looking back, I realized the river had taken everything from me once, my trust, my marriage, the life I thought I knew. But it had also given me something back, the chance to rise, to begin again. From the bottom of the darkest depths, I had climbed out, gasping, shaking, but alive. And in the arms of the man who had saved me, I finally understood. Sometimes life doesn't just hand you second chances. Sometimes you have to fall into the abyss to find them. I wasn't the same woman who had stood on that cliff, blind to the truth. I was stronger now, fiercer, free.